Okay, welcome to lesson 11. This is actually one of the more important lessons that we're going to have all semester. This is one that you might want to come back to and refer to when we get to the research paper, and it might be one that you want to even save so that you can have it for future classes. In this lesson, we're going to talk about the essentials of APA style and how to cite in APA style. So there are 4 objectives for this lesson. First, we're going to understand what do we mean by APA style? What is APA style? Second, we're going to learn how to create APA in-text citations. So you'll learn what they are and how to do them. Third, you're going to learn how to create APA reference citations. So learn what is a reference citation and how do we create those. After this lesson, before moving on to the next one, I want you to read in the Hacker book section APA 4A and APA 4B. So these two talk about how to cite in APA style. 4A talks about in-text citation, and 4B talks about references. So I'm going to cover the majority of what these pages cover, but there's also some tools that these pages provide that we aren't going to cover in this lesson, like if you have an odd citation format like a motion picture or something like that. I'm not going to talk about that in this lesson, but APA 4 will tell you how to cite a motion picture effectively. So definitely make sure you at least review those pages and know where they are as a tool as you're citing. Let's start with a brief review. In lesson 9, I talked about effective summarizing. How do you summarize a source effectively in your own words? Then in lesson 10, I talked about effective quoting. How do you quote from sources effectively? How do you select your quotes and how do you integrate your quotes well? In that lesson, I sort of touched a little bit on APA in-text citation, but I'm going to pick that up here and talk about that a bit more. So both summarizing and quoting are ways of bringing authors' ideas into your own writing. However, anytime you bring someone else's ideas into your own writing, you need to make sure that you give appropriate credit for any of the ideas or language that you bring into the essay. Even Mr. T says, "Give credit where credit's due. I pity the fool who doesn't give credit to their sources." When you don't give credit, you're plagiarizing. So definitely make sure you listen to Mr. T because he knows what he's talking about. Imagine if you were an author of a book and somebody took your ideas or your words without giving you credit. You'd probably be upset. And so don't do that to other authors as well. In addition to not being very nice, it's also, a major academic offense to pass somebody else's ideas or language off as your own. So you definitely want to make sure that you're giving credit in the correct way. So to give credit in academic writing, you need to make sure you use a citation style. So there are many types of citation styles. You may have seen footnotes in some books that you've read before that have like a note on the bottom of the page, and then you can sort of, as you're reading, you see a 1 and you flip down to the bottom and you find out what that 1 has to talk about. So you might see footnotes in some books. Also, a lot of other colleges use MLA citation style, and a lot of high schools use MLA citation style as well. So you might be familiar with this citation method. It's very similar to APA. There's just some slight differences. So if you're familiar with APA, you have a kind of a good leg up on citation style. So each of these is just basically different ways of giving credit to your sources. So at our school, we use APA citation style to give credit to the authors for their ideas or their language. So in APA citation style, there are 2 ways that you need to give authors credit. You need to give authors credit in text. So as you're writing, you need to mention the authors to give them credit for ideas and language. And you need to give credit on a reference page. So at the end of your writing, anytime you bring sources in, you need to make sure you create a reference entry for each source. And the reference entry gives detailed information about where somebody could find that source. So for the in-text citations, there are 2 things you need to mention as you're writing. First, you need to always mention the author's last name, and you need to mention the year that the author wrote that article or book or source. So if you're summarizing, you might say something like Smith 2006 says da-da-da, and you're covered. If you're quoting an article directly using quotation marks and borrowing the language, you need to do a little bit more. In addition to mentioning the author's last name and the year, you also need to mention the page number where you found the quote. So for a direct quote, you might say Smith 2006 says quote, and then at the end you'd put page number P.6. But we'll look at that a little bit more closely in a second, but these are the basics of in-text citation. Always mention the author's name and the year. If you're quoting directly, make sure you mention the page number. So in addition to doing your in-text citations as you're writing, mentioning the author's names and years, you also want to create a reference entry. So let's take a closer look at in-text citations and reference citations. So in-text citations. So you need to make sure, as I said before, that you mention the author and the year. So there are two ways that you can do this. So you can either do it before the summary or the quote, or you can do it after the summary or the quote. Let's take a look at an example. So you could start a summary by saying, according to Smith, 2005, da-da-da, and you're covered. Or you could start a quote by saying, according to Smith, 2005, comma, since it's only an incomplete sentence, quote, P.6, period at the end of the information. So for the direct quote, you need the page number as well. So you could do it that way for both of these, introducing the information with the author and the year. Or you could put it at the end. So if you don't introduce the information with the author and the year, you can put it all at the end. So you could say, one author says da-da-da, and then at the end you just put Smith 2005 all in parentheses. So you put these all in parentheses because you're not using Smith in the sentence. In this case, we're using Smith in the sentence. We say according to Smith, so we only put 2005 in parentheses. Or we could do it this way with direct quote. One author says, comma, quote, da-da-da, Smith 2005, P.6. And there's actually supposed to be a space here, like how there is right here. So it's P.6, period. So anytime you're doing a summary or a quote, make sure you introduce it with the author and the year, or put the author and the year at the end, and make sure you use page numbers for the direct quotes. So if there are two authors, you want to make sure you mention both authors. So you would say, according to Smith and Jones, 2015, or these authors say da-da-da, Smith and Jones, 2015. If there are 3 to 5 authors, you want to mention all of them the first time. So every time the first time, you want to mention all of them the first time, and after that you want to cite just the first author and this phrase, ETAL period, which basically means and all the other guys. So the first time you'd say, according to Smith, Jones, Wegman, Hart, and Riley, 2010, da-da-da. And then the next time you want to cite that source, you'd say, according to Smith et al., 2010, da-da-da. So when you put the et al., you're covered. If there are 6 or more authors, like you have a research study with a lot of authors, you just mention the ETAL, the first author, and ETAL from the start. So you'd say Jones et al., 2010, da-da-da, and you're covered for that. So these are all ways of giving credits to multiple authors in your texts. But sometimes there's no author given, or if you can't find an author, you want to try to use the company or the organization. And it's very rare that you have a case where you can't find some kind of company or some kind of organization to give credit to. So I always tell people, use the organization or company. So you'd say something like, according to the Department of Education, 2014, since they didn't give us a specific author, we just mention the department. Or we could say, one company says da-da-da, Study Smart 2014, and Study Smart would be the name of the company. So if no author is given, make sure you use the organization or company instead. So there's a couple of exceptions to these rules too. So if the year is not given, so anytime there is a year, you want to use it, but if the year is not given, you want to put N period D period for no date. So we'd say, according to Jones, N period D period, da-da-da, page 4, because we didn't have a date on Jones. Or one author says, da-da-da, Jones, no date, page 4, period. So in addition to having to no date sometimes page numbers aren't provided. If page numbers are provided, like for a book or a journal article, you just use whatever page number happens to be on the particular page that you're citing from. But if there aren't any page numbers provided, like on a web page, you want to cite the paragraph number. So you should really count down the paragraphs and say, what paragraph was this on the web page? According to Jones 2013, paragraph 6. So that would indicate that this information came from the 6th paragraph in the essay. So lastly, sometimes you want to quote something that somebody else quoted. So now if we're getting into quoting other quotes, we're talking about a secondary source. So you need to make sure if you're going to cite a quote that somebody else quoted that you mention both authors. So you want to mention the original author who said the quote originally and the author that you got the quote from. So this is probably the most complicated kind of in-text citation, but it does happen quite a bit. So we would say, this is how you would set it up. You'd say, according to Jones, as cited by Smith, 2015. So in this case, Jones was the original author who said something, Smith was the author where you got it from. So you put the year of the author where it came from. So we have Smith 2015, that'll be on our reference page. In Smith's article, he quotes Jones, but we want to use that quote by Jones, so we'd say, according to Jones, as cited by Smith 2015, Here's another example. One author says and then at the end we'd say Jones, as cited by Smith, 2015, page 4. And that indicates that Jones said something that Smith quoted, and we're quoting that as well. So that's probably the craziest of all the citations, but it's a good one to know. So let's take a quick look at some sample in-text citations. Here's one from a nice research paper on why teenagers should not be allowed to drop out of school. So this person gives several reasons in her research paper for why teens should not be allowed to drop out of school, but this reason is actually talking about how teenagers aren't mature enough to drop out of school. So let's take a quick look at this paragraph. After numerous studies performed on the brain throughout the years, research has shown that the teenage brain is a work in progress and functions very differently from an adult's. The frontal lobes, and particularly the prefrontal cortex, are one of the last areas of the brain to develop. Researchers now believe that the prefrontal cortex, responsible for things like organizing plans and ideas, forming strategies, and controlling impulses, is not fully developed until the late 20s. Newman, 2010, page 6. Newman, 2010, also notes that the prefrontal cortex also governs reasoning and forethoughts. A given example is that a teenager would not think twice when getting into a car being driven by another teen who is drunk. Therefore, teenagers are not mature enough to make life-changing decisions, such as to drop out of high school. So this is a nice paragraph, and it makes a nice point as well. Teenagers' brains aren't quite mature enough. And here she's citing a research study done by Newman. And she has a quote from Newman, and she sort of summarizes Newman's ideas. So she uses the quote as part of the summary. And she doesn't introduce the quote with Newman, she just kind of brings the quote in. I would say actually she doesn't quite give enough context for this quote, but she sort of drops the quote in. But here's a quote on how the brain's not fully developed. So at the end she cites Newman, the year 2010, page 6, and that covers that quote. But then she wants to continue with Newman's ideas in a summary, so she says Newman 2010 also notes, and then she kind of summarizes his point in here. So there's a good example of how in-text citation would work in an actual essay. Let's take a look at one more example. So this is just a single author. So this is building a paragraph on a single author. But let's take a look at this paragraph as well. So here's another example of a paragraph that talks about some of the statistics about dropping out. And in this paragraph, the author uses multiple sources. Do you know how many high school students drop out every day? According to the Ad Council 2004, about 7,000 students drop out of school every day. This means 1 out of every 3 high school students equals 1 dropout every 26 seconds. In total, around 2.6 million students do not finish high school every year. FCSBoston.org, 2010, page 6. If this trend continues, nearly 13 million high school students will drop out in the next 10 years. The Alliance for Excellent Education, 2009. 40 years ago, the United States of America was #1 when it came to graduation rates in the world. However, as of today, it's fallen to 19th place. Do something. No date. So here's a good example of a paragraph that integrates multiple sources. Actually, this author cites several different sources here. You see there's the Ad Council is one. and then FSC Boston's 2, Alliance for Excellent Education is 3, and DoSomething.org is 4. So we have 4 sources cited in here. And she gives credit to each of those sources. So the first statistics, 7,000 students, 1 out of every 3 years, comes from the Ad Council 2004. 2.6 million do not finish every single year, comes from FSC Boston, and since it's a direct quote, she uses a page number. Here, 13 million high school students will drop out in 10 years, comes from here. And the United States has fallen to 19th place, comes from this source. So here's a good way of integrating your sources and making sure that you give appropriate credit to each of the sources with the in-text citations. But let's flip back to the PowerPoint now. So sometimes you can have trouble locating your authors and years, and it can be tricky, depending on the types of sources, to figure out who is the author of this source and what was the year that the source wrote it. So let's talk about the 3 major types of sources: books, articles, and journals, and we'll take a look at examples of where we can find the authors and the dates so that we don't have any trouble bringing those in our in-text citations. So for books, the authors are pretty much always on the front cover. However, if the book's a compilation of authors' works, you want to use the name of the author of the individual document that you're citing. So for instance, the book for this course is Graf, Birkenstein, and Durst are the editors, but Zinchenko might be an author within there. In that case, you'd want to use the author Zinchenko as your source. So the year is a little bit tricky to find in a book. A lot of times it's on the copyright page. So let's take a quick look at a sample. So here's a sample of a book. This is actually a slightly older version of our book, but I could find this electronic copy. I couldn't find an electronic copy of our book. But here, so we have the title is right here. They say, I say, the moves that matter in persuasive writing. The authors are Graf and Birkenstein. We actually have Durst on ours as well. So they're the editors of the book. If we look at the next page, this is the copyright page. And here's an example of a copyright page. It's usually the 2nd or 3rd pages in. And this is where we'll find the year. So right here it says 2007. But also on the copyright page, it'll tell you who published it, Norton, and where it was published, which is down here, New York, New York. So those are actually going to be really important for creating a reference citation. So this page is important for creating reference citations for books. In addition to books, it can also be a little bit tricky to find the authors and years in journal articles. Although these are usually on the front pages as well. So make sure you look at the top of the page. Do you see an author or a year at the top? Also look at the bottom of the page or the end. Is there an author of the year there? If you can't find a year, just use ND, no date, for the year. So let's take a look at a sample of that. So here's an example of a research study. So you might see some like this if you get them from the online library. Research study always has the title in the center. This is Presenteeism and Absenteeism, Differentiated Understanding of Related Phenomenon. The authors are here, so it's Eric Goslin and Louise Lemire and Wayne Corneille. So there's 3 authors for this. And the year is up here. So a lot of times journal articles will do this. I don't know why they keep jumping like that, but journal articles will do this where they'll put the year up at the top in small print. And it also tells us the name of the journal, which is Journal of Occupational Health Psychology. Here's the volume and issue. Those are going to be important for creating reference citations as well. Finally, it can be trickiest to find the authors and the years on web pages. Since there's a lot of different variations on web pages, the authors could be at the top, they could be at the bottom, they could be at the beginning of the article, they could be at the end of the article. There could not be any authors, there could not be any year. So there's a lot of variation with the web pages. If you can't find a person as an author, just use the organization where the article came from or who created the web page. And if you can't find the date, just use the ND. So here's an article that was published in Industry Week, which I guess is an industrial magazine. And the name of the article is 5S without 5 Ys, just housekeeping, and it's an article about lean manufacturing. Actually looks pretty interesting. So this one does give us the author right here. So a lot of times newspapers, like web newspapers or web periodicals, will have a format similar to this, with the title here, then the authors underneath the titles. So the author is Robert Simonis, and the year is April 14th, 2015. So we say Simonis 2015. Here's the title, and we also know that it came from Industry Week. Let's take a look at one more. Here's another article on lean manufacturing, but this is just kind of a short brief right here. So it's just a little bit about what lean manufacturing is. It tells us a little bit about the process. As we can see, there's really no author here, right? I don't see any person, so in this case we would just use the organization. So this is from the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. So we'd say the EPA is the author, and then year. Do we see a year? Well, there's this one down here at the end. Last updated Wednesday, February 4th, 2015. This we could use. We could say that's the year. So I would say February 4th, 2015 is the year that this was written, since it was last updated then. However, if you see another website that says copyright at the bottom, you can't use the copyright dates, but you can use last updated dates. Or maybe it'll give the date at the top. So those are the ways of locating your authors and years. And that's also a little bit on how to integrate your in-text citations. So hopefully you feel pretty comfortable in finding your authors and years, as well as integrating your in-text citations. But let's flip now to the next important aspect of citations, which is references. So in addition to citing your sources in text, you also need to create a references page, right? And title this page References, even if you only have one. So put your references up at the top, just like this. So what goes into each reference entry depends on the type of source that you're using. This is where the citation format gets a little bit complicated, because each source has different requirements for the reference citation. As a general rule, reference citations always include the author's last name and first initial, or the organization, if it's an organization, the year, the title of the piece, and then the source information. So use the same author name and year that you use for your in-text citations, and then you just want to add what's the title of the piece and what's the source information, where did it come from. So the title is always the title of the book, the title of the article, the title of the web page, and the source information is different depending on the type. So like I mentioned at the beginning, Hacker lists over 30 different types of sources and gives detailed information on how to cite each source in APA 4B, so definitely make sure you read that section. However, the most basic, most common types of sources that you might encounter are either books, journal articles, or web pages. So I'm going to talk about how to create references for these three types of sources. So for books, a reference entry for a book needs the author, the last name and first initial, the year, the title of the book, and notice how it goes in italics and it's lowercase, the place of publication, where the book was published, and the publisher, who published the book. So for instance, for our Diana Hacker book, we would say Hacker, D. So it's Hacker, D for Diane, period, 2007, period. A writer's reference, 6th edition. This actually should have been lowercase. 6th edition. Place of publication is Boston. Then we have a full colon, and the publisher is Bedford St. Martin. So all books are basically the same. And you can find that information, again, either on the cover page or on the copyright page. So all this information on the place of publication and the publisher will be on that copyright page on the book. So let's take a quick look at a sample graph. So we said the title of the book is right up front. They Say, I Say, with readings, The Moves That Matter, and Persuasive Writing. The authors are Graf and Birkenstein. The year is 2007, and the place of publication is New York, and the publisher is Norton. So that's everything we'd need to create that citation. So in order to create that one, we would say Graf, comma, G, comma, and Birkenstein, comma, C, period, 2007, period. They Say, I Say, The Moves That Matter, and Persuasive Writing, period. New York, full colon, Norton. So for a chapter or an article in a book, and this is going to be really important because this is the kind of source that you're citing when you cite Zinchenko or Balko, you need the name of the author, the original author, which would be, Zinchenko, comma D, the year that he wrote it, 2002. The title of that piece is Don't Blame the Eater. Then you'd need the information from the book. So you'd say in G. Graph Ed, They Say, I Say with Reading, second edition, and then the page number 391 through 394. Place publication in this case is New York, and the publisher is Norton. So this is how we would cite that one. Zinchenko, D. 2002, Don't Blame the Eater, in Graph C. Birkenstein, and R. Durst, Eds, They Say, I Say with Reading, second edition, 391 through 393, New York, Norton. So if you're going to cite the Zinchenko piece in your first essay, you can just use this one right here. If you're going to, but in order to create one for the article that's going to be the basis for your summary or response, this last part will basically stay the same, but you're going to need to add the author and the year and the title. So that's how to do books. Let's talk a little bit about how to do journal articles. So for an article that's published in an academic journal, you need the last name and first initial, the year, the title of the journal article, then you also need the title of the journal where it appeared, and you need the volume and the issue. And you put it like this, like you'd say volume 6, issue 2. And then you need the page numbers, and then you just put like 62 through 65, period. So here's an example of an academic journal entry. Mentor K 2010, A Life for a Life, The American Debate Over the Death Penalty, Current Reviews for Academic Libraries is the name of the journal where it appeared. Volume 47, issue 12, page 2369 through 2371, period. So that's how you would cite a journal article. Most of that information, again, is going to be at the very top or the very bottom of the page. So we said before, for this one, the authors are Goslin, Lemire, and Cornell. The year, 2013. The title, Presenteeism and Absenteeism, Differentiated Understanding of Related Phenomenon. The journal is Journal of Occupational Health and Psychology. It's volume 18, number 1, pages 75 through 86. So that's how you would cite that source. So the last source is web pages. So these can be the trickiest because there's so much variety, but you don't actually need that much for a web page. You really just need the author or the organization, the year, the title of the article or section of the web page, and then you just put retrieved on, and then you mention the date that you got it from, and then you put from, and then you put the full link to the article. So it's just basically author, year, title, link, retrieved on, date, link. So here's an example of a web page citation. Bureau of Justice Statistics is the organization, 2006, period. The title is Death Penalty Statistics, period. And we just put retrieved 11/16/11 from, and then here's the full link that it came from. So that somebody could just open up that link and find that article. So it can be hard to find some of this information, so make sure you look over your web pages carefully and you know who the author is and you know what the title is. Often the web pages won't have years, right? So you need to put ND if there's no year given. Let's just take a quick look at that one. So for this source, we would just say Simonis, and we'd say 2015. The title's 5S without 5Y is just housekeeping. And we'd say retrieved on today's date. And then we'd say from, and then the link, www.industryweek.com/6 sigma/5S without 5Y, just housekeeping. So you need to put the entire link in there. Same thing for this one. This one's a little bit trickier, but we said the author's the EPA, right? And the year was at the bottom actually, so we'd say 2015 for the year. And then we have the title, Lean Manufacturing Environment, and we just say retrieved on today's date from www.epa.gov/lean/environment. And that would, and so that's how you do the web pages. So hopefully you have a pretty good idea of what's expected of the 3 major types of reference citations and how to find that information from the different places. So there's a couple of tools you can use to help you create your reference citations. So you can create them by hand. So when you know the format, like how I just talked about, you can just hand create them in Microsoft Word. Just put, the author, the year, the title, and the source information. You can also consult the Hacker Book. So if you forget what I talked about in here, open up that writer's reference. It's a really good tool, section APA 4B, and it'll tell you for each different type of source what do you need to put for that source. And you can just find those things on the source and include them in your reference entry. But also there's another way to make it a little bit faster, and you're probably going to wish that I had told you about this before going through this entire lesson, but there are some citation creators available, and a lot of people really like these citation creators. I think they do help because they can make it a little bit faster in some cases, but it's also, you also need to know where the information is and how to find it in order to use the citation creators effectively. But let's take a quick look at one of the citation creators. Here's a citation creator from a website called citationmachine.net, which is a pretty good citation one. So I tell people a lot, if you're going to use one, use citationmachine.net. So we could put in, they say, I say, to see if we can find the book. And sometimes it will actually find your book for you and just automatically create your reference citation. Could be it, so we just select it, and then it should create the reference citation for us. You can also choose other sources, so they could choose a newspaper, a website, or a journal article. And if it doesn't have any information, it'll ask you who's the author, what was the year, what's the title. So you still have to be able to find that information on your source, but these make it a lot more manageable in that they create the citations for you. And you don't have to actually do it by hand. And some people find that a bit easier. So there it is, Son of Citation Machine, it's called. It's a nice website. So finally, if you're using the Cambridge College Online Library, which we're going to talk about in Unit 4, as you're finding your sources, you can actually click a button that gives you the citation information for the sources. So this is actually the easiest, and this is why I'm going to really encourage you to use the online library. It makes it a lot easier to create your citations for you, and we'll cover that more when we talk about online databases. But yeah, EBSCO does have a nice feature that allows you to get the citation information from your sources. So those are some of the most helpful tools for creating your references. So let's just talk briefly about how do you organize a reference page, and what does a reference page look like when it's completed. So first, you need to make sure that if you have multiple sources, you put them in alphabetical order by the first item. So it's either the author or the organization. Just alphabetize them. It'll mix your books and sources all together, and that's fine. That's how it should be. Also use a hanging indent. In a hanging indent, you keep the first line all the way to the left, and every other line gets indented a full tab space. And then your next entry would start there, and you have an indent here. So you want to make sure you use your hanging indent as well. So let's take a quick look at a sample. So here's an example of that reference page from the article on high school dropouts. So as we can see, the sources are all alphabetized. There's the Alliance for Excellent Education that we saw in that other example, 2009. Here's the title, here's the retrieved on date, and here's the website. So that's a nice website, a nice example of a citation. She alphabetized all of her sources, and she has multiple sources here. And notice how she used that hanging indent. So the way you get that is you highlight all of your sources once you're done your reference, and then you just right-click on it, and you do paragraph, and then you just choose special hanging indent. She already has that selected. It usually won't be selected, but you just do hanging, and it'll automatically do that hanging indent for you. Also notice that her sources are all double spaced. You do want to keep them double spaced with your hanging indent. She has a pretty good mix of sources in here. If we look through, we can see she has some websites like that, but she also has some journal articles like this one. Here's another website. Here's a journal article. Here's another website. Here's another journal article. Here's another website. So she mostly has websites and journal articles. She doesn't actually have any books in here. I do find that a lot of times when people are writing research papers, they tend to stay away from books, even though books are really good sources. But she does have a good mix of websites and articles, and they all look like pretty good quality sources. She has them alphabetized well, and she's using the hanging indent. So really nice work with that. So hopefully that gives you the idea of what a reference page should look like. So let's just review quickly. I know there's a lot of information in this lesson. You're going to be asked to use APA citation in many of your courses, so you want to keep these things in mind. Remember the rules of in-text citation that we talked about. Always mention the author and the year with the page number for direct quotes. Also remember the rules of references, right? The major types of references you're going to see are articles from journals, websites, or books, and each of those has a slightly different format, so you want to make sure you're familiar with those formats that I talked about in here. Or the Hacker's a good tool as well. So in conjunction with the proper quoting and summarizing, using a citation method will help you to avoid plagiarism and give appropriate credit for your sources. And that'll make you successful in your academic writing. So hopefully you have the idea, but take a look at Hacker book, read APA section 4A and 4B for a little bit more on citation. I know this is a bit of a crash course in citation, but hopefully you have the idea now. So after reading that, move on to lesson 12, and I'll see you there.